This is the Pioneer GrowingPoint Agronomy Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast that talks everything agronomy and only agronomy, tackling current agronomy topics, management strategies, and covering topics generated from our listeners.
On this episode, we will discuss top dieback in corn, overall crop conditions, and a recap of what we toured last week in the crops.
And now your hosts, DuPont Pioneer field agronomists Josh Shofner and Brian Buck.
All right, Josh, so getting started first, I think things are cooking along pretty good. I was in a field just south of Belle Plaine yesterday where some 99-day corn was just starting to black layer. So talking about GDUs and heat and crop progression in general, can you maybe go through some of that?
Yeah, actually I can. I just kind of ran the numbers here before the show across the area. Looking at GDU accumulation, I ran everything starting April 20th. Again, we had some corn in ahead of that, and a fair amount that went in after that, but it was kind of about the point that we hit 50-60% planted. Rochester, we're at 2,206, Albert Lee, 2,383, Mankato, 2,415, and Alexandria, Brian, we work up north there, they're at 2,096, so really tremendous sitting here September 1st with the GDUs we got. I was in some 89-day corn planted in April that was fully black layered. But we're really sitting in a great spot maturity-wise.
Yeah, I'd say overall, in all the corn I've been in this week, the last 2 days here, most of it's sitting around that half milk line, so you're really looking at about 2 weeks until you get to black layer on those crops. But things are progressed really well. We got planted early, but those GDUs put us in a really good place for an early harvest.
Yeah, absolutely. So really spending a little time on corn here, Brian. I mean, my phone's been ringing quite a bit, a lot of texts, a lot of calls about the corn's changing rapidly, and mainly concerned about the top dieback we're seeing in corn. In some cases, Brian, we just talked about maturity. Some cases we're almost black layered or coming down the home stretch where, it's probably just natural senescence of the plant as we hit maturity. But with that said, there are some other factors going on that's causing that dieback to be a little bit premature.
Yeah, so you mentioned maturity. Just like a plant senesces and works its way up from the ground, it can also do it from the top down. So that is something you can see. But there are other things going on, and touring a lot of corn this week, it depends on the field. You still got to go out and check. So some other things that could be is nutrient deficiencies, either nitrogen, sulfur, potassium. We've had a lot of rainfall this year, so that opens us up to quite a bit of leaching, especially with the nitrogen and sulfur. But we've had a lot of rainfall, and that also opens us up to a lot of disease potential.
Yeah, and I think we should talk about the nutrients here a little bit. I mean, certainly as I've been walking fields here the last week or 10 days, I've seen nitrogen start to fire up pretty severe to the point where it's reached the ear leaf, all the way up there, which is probably a sign that we probably didn't quite have enough to make it, especially if we're only, half to a quarter milk line. Certainly probably ran out there. Seeing a little sulfur too. Not surprised that we're seeing a little bit of both. Both nutrients extremely mobile in the soil. In some cases we had like the wettest July and August on record up here in parts of Minnesota. So probably not a surprise that some of those nutrients leached away from us. And not surprised if we're seeing nitrogen, we're seeing sulfur right along with it.
Yeah, so both very mobile. And the rainfall, you can almost see it in the pockets as the soil type changes out there with the nutrient deficiencies. And often you'll see the corn right now, it's green to the bottom, green to the top in areas, but wherever you see that nitrogen deficiency firing up as the soil type changes, that's also where you might see some of that top dieback. So nutrients have played a big part into top dieback. Some of it's maturity, some of it's nutrients. And then the last piece Josh talked about is the diseases that can cause top dieback also. And there's a couple different ones out there, and let's try to talk through each of them.
Yeah, I think the two we'll spend the most time on is anthracnose, and then looking at crown rot, which is likely being caused by fusarium. Anthracnose, Brian, probably the most common corn disease really we see each and every year coming down the home stretch. We see those stalk rots start to set in, and certainly the weather has maybe favored it to some extent with all the moisture and everything we've had. But certainly anthracnose is starting to set in. We're seeing that, that stalk start to rot out. And Brian, let's just discuss some of the symptoms, visually that we can see with anthracnose for our listeners so they can identify that properly.
Yeah, so there's a couple different pieces to anthracnose. And early on in the season, you can actually have it on the leaves. We saw it especially this year following the frost, just some early season leaf disease. But what we're really looking at as we move through the season is the actual stock quality itself starting to go. And one of the biggest symptoms I usually see is on the outside of the plant, right on the stalk itself, around the nodes, you get that black, almost it looks like it's bleeding black on the outside. And that's kind of a telltale sign, and often once you split those plants or those stalks, you start to see a lot of hollowed out stalks, and that's just that remobilization of the carbohydrates up into the plant, or just the fungus itself starting to take over.
When you split that stalk too, you're going to see some discoloration at the nodes, and if you're seeing that bleeding, that black specks on the outside, and you see the discoloration of the node, a pretty classic symptom that you're probably dealing with some anthracnose. Brian, the other thing that we've really dealt with the last 3 years, it seems like more and more, is the Fusarium crown rot, and something that we're already starting to see this year as well.
Yeah, so Fusarium is a complex that I'd say is getting more common. Fusarium, and you might also hear Gibberella stalk rot, they're very closely related, but also a little bit different. So Fusarium is going to be a little bit just more pale white within the stalk. So you're going to see that inner tissue of the stalk itself degrade just like you would with a lot of other diseases, stalk rots, crown rots. The difference being it just doesn't have the color some others do. So that pith will start to pull away from the outside stalk itself and hollow out. But one thing you got to be careful of, another thing you can look, often it usually starts down in the crown itself. So if you split that stalk all the way through the root, you'll generally see a discolored crown at the bottom. And once that crown shuts down, it can't translocate water, nutrients, or anything up the plant. And it can shut it down quick. Often you'll see a plant out in a field that kind of has that grayish green appearance where it just kind of looks like it died overnight. And often that's from like a crown rot, and that's just from shutting off all the flow within the plant.
Yeah, so just kind of summarize this up. The nutrient deficiencies that we talked about, the anthracnose, the crown rot, all those things put pretty tremendous stress on a corn plant coming down the stretch, and all three of those can lead to seeing that top dieback or dieback, from the bottom or the top. And the main reason we see that dieback is the plant's going to do whatever it can to try to put as much yield and finish the grain fill as successfully as it can. And as it mobilizes carbohydrates, since other parts of the plants are shutting down, photosynthesis gets limited because of nutrient deficiency and diseases, it'll mobilize, all those carbohydrates to try to finish out. And that's why we're seeing some of the color get sucked out of the top of the plants, because it's pulling those carbohydrates out, trying to finish out the ear.
Yeah, and often it can be one compounding the other two. If you have a severe nitrogen deficiency, you're more likely to have an anthracnose come in and take over the plant at the bottom also, and affect stock quality. So,
yeah, and management strategies, thinking about what to do. Obviously, good tillage practices. If we can get residue breakdown, that's probably one of the biggest things we can do. And obviously, taking a look at variety selection. Some products are a little bit stronger in these diseases than others. And diseases like anthracnose, foliar fungicides, extremely effective on anthracnose, and can prevent that infection, help standability, and get some pretty tremendous yield advantages on years that anthracnose is present as well. I don't want to neglect soybeans here quick, Brian. Obviously, I still think the biggest topic with soybeans is sudden death syndrome. Really seeing it start to set in as we get to maturity, but certainly probably going to be, in my opinion, probably the biggest yield limiting factor in soybeans this year.
Yeah, last year we talked all about white mold. This year it's been sudden death syndrome. And, sudden death syndrome, if you think about it as a complex in general, it's a fungus, but it infects through the roots. And so areas you're going to see more pressure in are fields that are compacted, just because that puts more stress on the plant and the roots. Areas that are really wet, so if you have waterways where a lot of water flows or just low spots in the field, can be quite a bit of an issue. But also areas or fields that have a lot of cyst pressure, we tend to see quite a bit more too. So, looking at long term, if you've had SDS this year, you're probably a good chance you're going to have it when you come back to beans again. Or if you're planning on going to a farm next year that has had a history of it. Some things you can do, variety selection is important. There's a new seed treatment on the market that's very effective also. Otherwise, managing drainage and compaction is the other big thing too. So if you can get 2 out of the 3 done really well, you'll probably do a pretty good job against SDS, but trying to do, all 3 can help too.
Yeah, certainly the stage we're at, once it's set in the summer, there wasn't a lot we could do, but something we'll talk about quite a bit here through the winter months and as we get through harvest, try to put together a good game plan for the 2017 crop. Obviously, Brian, last week was kind of a busy, exciting week. We'd been kind of out for 3 weeks doing our Pioneer GrowingPoint agronomy training site tours, which it was great to see all the people that came out and some good interaction there. But also we had the Pro Farmer Tour last week, and we participated in some events around that locally and made it to the finale. It was good to see everybody out there, but I don't necessarily want to get into the comparison of their numbers to the USDA, but I'd like to maybe talk about some of the yield estimates we saw locally. Brian, we kind of hit our similar route that we do every year, kind of taking a look at some yields before we get to the event in Rochester, and overall, we saw some pretty good things out there.
Yeah, pretty consistent. The one thing that surprised me the most was I'd say a third of the farms we got into had some pretty good noses on some of the corn. So immediately when you see that, you usually think, oh, this isn't going to yield great. But once you actually took and looked at the yield potential out there, there's still a lot of yield out there. The girth itself was still good, rose around, and the length was even good, even with that nose there. It's just it gave up a little overall top end potential. So I'd say that's the one thing that jumped out at me. And then the other one is the field we stopped at that's his really coarse soil and historically has been maybe a little bit lower on our yield scale when we do the tour. And just with all the rainfall we had this year, the yield looked like it was still going to be pretty good there. Yeah,
we definitely saw the nutrient deficiencies on the lighter ground much more defined, which probably not surprised based on the rain. But with that said, like you said, I know we pulled some samples and we were a little scared of the nose, but by the time we got done doing yield estimates, the numbers were quite a bit better than we thought. The part that surprised me when we were all said and done, our overall number was a little better than last year, but we were in this extreme southeast corner of the state where they get really good drainage. They got a lot of rolling contours, and certainly that helps where they can shed the water better. But I'll be curious to see how this crop shakes out. Last year, as we moved west across southeast Minnesota, the crop got a little better. This year, I think with drainage issues and other things, I think coming east, maybe the crop's going to be a little bit better. Didn't see as much leaf disease, not as much northern corn leaf blight. I think from a disease standpoint, it's all going to hinge on the anthracnose and crown rot. What's going to limit yield, and we'll kind of see how that shakes out in the next couple weeks. But overall, I think, Brian, I was encouraged what we saw in the corn overall.
Yeah, I mean, to recap it, I would agree. As you move east, I think the crop's going to be pretty solid because we shedded water well. There's going to be some areas that had huge rainfall events that don't drain as well or just don't have the rolling topography to help. And as you move north up into that Alexandria area, north of there, and get especially in some of that irrigation or those high productive sands, that crop looked really good up there too. But I think one of the things I'm most excited about is we are going to be black layering a lot of this within the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So you think about that. If you can black layer that early, for one, we missed the frost risk by quite a bit, or that is way less. But the other thing is it gives us a good chance for dry down, and we can get through everything quite a bit quicker in the fall.
Oh, absolutely. And some of our colleagues, in Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, did some yield estimates last week, and I took a look at their results, and I think there's an excellent crop up in the northern part of Minnesota and Wisconsin. And again, it's pretty straightforward and pretty simple. We got the heat. They're not going to get probably in much trouble from frost. On some of those coarser soils, they've had good moisture all year, and probably not surprised that we're going to see potentially a really good crop up there. So yeah, it was an exciting week. Excited what we're seeing for potential out there, and we'll kind of see how it shakes out as harvest will probably get underway here in the month of September for corn for sure. In some cases, maybe jump ahead of some soybean harvest as well.
Yeah, one take home I'd say on corn is be ready to go get it this fall. With this wet of a year, there's always the chance for more. You black lay early, you're going to have more chance for stock issues as it dries down closer to that 15, 16, 18%.
Yep, just scout fields the next 2-3 weeks, get a harvest plan put in place, and execute it, and we should be in good shape. So, well, Brian, some timely topics there. It was good to cover. Always important to review where we can find our podcasts.
Yeah, so we can find it either on YouTube if you search our name followed by Pioneer. Otherwise, if you talk to your local Pioneer sales rep, they can get you on our opt-in email list. Otherwise, we always put it out on Twitter, which is maybe one of the easiest ways. You can either follow myself at FarmerBuck1.
And I am at Josh Shofner.
Josh, that's a wrap for this week's podcast. This podcast is recorded from the Agronomy Bunker Studio in Zumbrota, Minnesota. It is produced by Brian Buck and Josh Shofner. This is a bi-weekly podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next time.